Hello and welcome to a special New Year's edition of The World This Week, The World This Year, you might want to call it. I'm François Picard, and we're joined by a distinguished panel today. Christopher Dickey of Newsweek and the Daily Beast, Aude Baron, editor-in-chief of Le Plus Nouvel Obs, which is, again...
Which is a participative section on the internet of Le Nouvel Observateur. So citizens and experts can write about the news.
All right, one of the leading French news weekly magazines, citizen journalist website, or?
Yeah, it's a website.
It's a website as well. And Patrick Smith of the Africa Report, published monthly.
Yep, with a brand new edition in the shops telling you all you need to know about what's going to go on in 2012.
And Stephen Erlanger, Paris bureau chief for the New York Times.
There's an edition every day.
Updated several times a day.
Exactly, endlessly.
Okay.
Even true of Newsweek.
Last week, we saw how the Arab Spring blossomed pretty much spontaneously. Now comes the hard part. Nations like Egypt and Tunisia find themselves having to pick leaders for leaderless revolutions. Now, everywhere there's been elections, the big winners, Stephen Erlanger, have been...
Well, the big winners have been the Islamists, and that's not a bad thing, frankly. But it's not necessarily a good thing because there are lots of different kinds of Islamists and they believe lots of different kinds of things. The Muslim Brotherhood, it seems to me, I mean, others may disagree, was the inevitable beneficiary because it was always seen as the opposition. It was repressed by these old regimes, but it was very well organized, had a lot of money, some of it from the outside. It did a lot of charity work. It was in the villages with the people. So they're recognizable. That would make sense. The big question for Egypt, for example, is what kind of deal has the army struck with the Muslim Brotherhood? Will the Muslim Brotherhood split? Blah, 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 blah. I mean, this we'll have to see. But by itself, you know, the general support for the Islamists makes perfect sense and should not be a great concern, I don't think.
Patrick Smith?
Well, it's certainly the case that the Islamists have taken over the spirit of the revolution, which appeared to be a very secular and non-theocratic spirit when it started. I think it's going to be very, very difficult to predict how it's going to pan out. I think it will. The feeling that events in Egypt may parallel those in Turkey, where you have this contest between the military and the Islamists, and somehow they find there's an accommodation. I think that could be possible. I think what's particularly striking in Egypt, and certainly the first round that we've seen so far, is that the brothers who have been active in Egypt for 80 years, they got 36%, and the Salafists, the extremely conservative Islamist group, got over 20%. Egypt's going to be the only country in which groups like the Salafists have a seat in parliament. They have opted for parliamentary politics, so it's an entirely new political tactic for them to compete for votes like that.
In Egypt, we saw Salafist posters where women were represented by flowers, or in at least one case by the candidate's husband. How is this going to play out, though, in a nation that's used to 14 million Western tourists a year, Christopher?
Well, it's not going to be good for tourism. I think we can say with some confidence tourism is going to suffer, is suffering, and is going to suffer in Egypt. But I think as we look forward, it's important to realize that we are at a whole new stage in Arab history because of the demographics of the Arab world, because of the connectivity of the Arab world now. I mean, when I first started going there 25 years ago, you could barely get a landline to make a telephone call. Now everybody has cell phones, everybody has satellite television, a lot of people are on the internet, and the majority of the population is under 25 years old. A lot of, in Yemen, the majority is under 18. So this is a whole different dynamic going ahead. And I think the one thing that is predictable is that it's going to be completely unpredictable. I was in Tahrir Square in 2010 as Mubarak was coming down. And having lived in Egypt for 6 years over the years, I was surprised 3 or 4 times a day something would happen that I simply could not have imagined happening before. And I think that's going to continue.
The economy, I mean, is also going to be a huge issue. I mean, which I think is going to be a moderating force on whichever coalition dominates Egyptian politics. They simply have to change the way business is done. And some of the prescriptions, particularly the Salafist prescriptions, just wouldn't make sense in a modern world. And I think that's where you're going to see a huge pressure for compromise on the brothers to make deals with perhaps some secularist forces or less religious forces, simply to get the economy moving. Because this is going to be the first time they're really going to be put to the test electorally.
You might also see someone like Amr Moussa, who's basically a secularist, becoming president of Egypt. I mean,
former head of the Arab League.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that's a good thing particularly, but it again would be a moderating force, particularly for the outside world, to feel that there was somebody there, that they had some idea who they were and what they thought.
We're talking about the youth here, and you have, it seems, are they contradictory? On the one hand, conservative religious values, and on the other hand, this sort of Generation Y ethos of going on social networking sites, even to find soulmates.
Well, when you look on the social networks and on the internet, you mainly see the youth. So you only hear, well, you hear mainly the same voice. And they want, freedom and liberty, and they want the right for democracy. And one of the big stakes for next year is, will the movement will continue on the internet, and especially when you see a country like Syria, where the information is difficult to access, and some hackers, really help the people to communicate with each other and with the Western world. And we just have to hope that those hackers, well, first they won't have any problem, and then they will continue, because they've been doing this for months and months, and maybe after a while they will get tired and they will stop. And I met one of them last week, and he was saying that, at the beginning there were thousands because they were very excited, and now there are only a few dozens, and maybe after, month after month, the movement will decline.
Do you sense revolution fatigue, Christopher Dickey?
Yeah, in the outside world, yes, people are like, oh, no, not another story about Arab revolutions, or when's Syria ever going to end? Of course, people are very cynical and they get tired very fast. I don't think there's revolution fatigue in these countries. I think there's a lot of disappointment that things haven't been delivered more quickly. But I think that, just reflecting on what Patrick said, we really are going to see some interesting things happen as the Islamists, for instance, are given the responsibility of governing. I don't think they can do it. I think we actually are going to see, it would be a good guess, that we will see the beginning of the end of the Islamic trend over the next couple of years, because they're not going to be able to deliver, and we're going to have this chaotic situation, and the outside world will get tired of it. But I think the fact that people, especially young people, are living in a dynamic environment now where things can change is just amazing. I mean, for decades, for 2-3 generations in the Arab world, nothing really changed.
I want to get back to one point that Patrick was mentioning earlier, which is Turkey. Now, there's competing foreign influences tugging at one another in places like Egypt. There's the Gulf states, where there's lots of conservative Muslims from Egypt who've gone to find work. There's the U.S., which plows a lot of aid into the country, mostly military. And then there's the growing star places like Turkey, whose prime minister got a rock star welcome when he visited Egypt a few months back. That's all the more remarkable, Patrick, that Turkey was once home to the old colonizers, the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, it's history repeating itself with a very different take. Erdogan's had a brilliant year. So has Qatar. I think those have been the internal beneficiaries of the Arab Spring have clearly been the Islamists, and the external beneficiaries, if you like, have been Turkey and Qatar. They've both moved very quickly to back the winners. Turkey's case was really interesting because Erdogan had won the Muammar Gaddafi Human Rights Prize a year ago, and then suddenly he discovered that Muammar Gaddafi was a really bad guy and needed overthrowing.
So what happens vis-a-vis his neighbor, Syria?
He's going to be one of the décideurs. There's no question about that. Turkey's influence in the region, I think, has been enhanced. It's very much in keeping with the move within the Arab League. I mean, for the first time in its history, the Arab League has sanctioned a member at that level, not only supported the bombing against Gaddafi initially, but then moved against Syria, which regards itself as a cornerstone of the Arab League. And Erdogan is right up with them. And I think it's really going to enhance Turkey's status, and as a model also, not just as a sort of political actor, but as a model. We can have an Islamic State that produces economic growth, and I think that's the real challenge to all the governments in the region. Is that going to be possible elsewhere?
All right, well, one final point on this before we move on. Stephen Erlinger, we talk about the West's waning influence in these places. We're seeing the final pullout of U.S. troops from Iraq. We're seeing further along the start of the drawdown in Afghanistan. Are we being too hard on the United States when they do that? After all, they're rolling with the punches, as it were.
Well, yeah, and also, frankly, they have a lot of interests in the Pacific, which everyone forgets, and China is a big issue, and they need to look a little harder at what China's up to, and they have friends and allies. But I think the Americans aren't going to go away. Don't mistake it. I think what's fascinating, though, is you have different models in the Arab world that have died. One was Arab nationalism, Nasserism. Then you had this military model, which they tried to turn into a sort of dynasty. And now you're going to have some kind of vaguely Islamist model. I'm not sure that's going to work any better. There's a lot of chaos and confusion. The stakes are extremely high, not just for the United States, but for the King of Jordan, the King of Morocco, the Saudis. I mean, things are in play, and that means the United States is going to play a role. Turkey alone is not the answer.
Well, it's amazing to watch the confusion of the United States, as a matter of fact, as it looks at this. I mean, we forget, as I pointed out in an essay that's in the issues to 2012, that dictators are very convenient. There was just one go-to guy in any country. Either he was royal or he was a general. You went to him, things got decided, they got done or they didn't get done, but you only had to talk to one guy. Who do you talk to now in Egypt? The Americans still act as if you can just talk to the military, but you can't. They literally do not know who to talk to now. And that is a scary position if you are the Secretary of State or the President of the United States and you're looking at one of your most important allies in one of the most volatile regions in the world. But that's the way it is. It is what it is at this point.
Right. Who do you talk to in those countries? Who do you talk to back in the United States? An election year is beginning in a nation more than ever polarized between right and left, and where we've seen suspicions of those in the high halls of power take on new forms. If the start of the year began with everybody here in France trying to understand what le Tea Party, the Tea Party is, now comes Occupy Wall Street and its affiliated franchises in several cities. Chris Radicki, for our viewers who are not in the United States, is this just college kids? What's going on here?
No, it's a much bigger cross-section of the population. It is, in its way, Occupy Wall Street is the left-wing equivalent of the Tea Party on the right. It's an expression of fear and anger and a desire to see something change, although in both cases it isn't really clear what people want to change.
Well, what's clear is they don't know what they know what they don't want.
They know what they don't like and don't want, absolutely.
So that's first a good point. And what's very interesting about this movement is how it spread all around the world, because you had on the one side the indignates in Spain, and on the other side you had Occupy Wall Street. And all the movement, you know, they just merged together, and you had all those demonstrations all around the world. And after, you need... when a movement has success or not, and when you observe in the US, Occupy Wall Street is still very active, whereas when you look at in Europe, you know, the movement, well, there are some movements, there are a few demonstrations, but they don't have the media behind them, and that's one of their weakness. And in the US, the media came because of the movement, to express the reason of the movement, and then they came back because you had some movie stars, some actors, some singers who came. So the media came for the people aspect of the movement, where in Europe, the stars don't want to be involved.
Patrick Smith, I've heard it said that in the case in the UK, with the Occupy St. Paul's, I believe it was, people became quickly disenchanted when they started to organize stuff a little too much.
I think one of the points is, as everyone says, we know what we don't want. That's the sort of clarion call. But they also set up a tent with a library in it. And a friend of mine said any movement that sets up a tent with a library in it to find out what we do want you know, he's going to get his backing. And I can see the point. I think it's more diffuse now, and they had this confrontation with the religious authorities in London, and in fact, you know, one of the clerics had to resign as a result of this. So I think popular support is still quite high, because it does ring all the right bells. Skepticism about politicians, their hypocrisy, their corruption, skepticism about the bankers who've caused this crisis. We've talked about youth unemployment. It's all put in the bag. The problem is it's all too simplistic, and there isn't now a counter movement to say what we do want. But it's just the mantra is change, and that worked pretty well for Obama, I think, in 2008.
All right, so there's this diffuse anger. Does it help or hurt Barack Obama as he bids for re-election?
I don't think it actually hurts him terribly. I'm not sure how much it helps him. I mean, I think what you have is a generalized response to fear, to economic fear. I mean, fear that, you know, the credit crisis is going to get worse. We see it. Unemployment is getting worse. It's beginning to pick up a bit in the United States, unlike in Europe. American stimulus is finally kicking in. I mean, American presidents try to time these things properly. We'll see if Obama times it right. But the economy will define whether he's reelected as much as the Republican candidate will. I mean, it now looks on the Republican side that you're not going to get a Tea Party candidate. You'll probably get Romney or get Gingrich. I think probably at this point Romney is more of a danger to Obama than Gingrich, but it's early. It's hard to know. But I think Obama is very vulnerable because the magic is gone. People are upset. They think he's smart, but they don't think he's been very effective.
Christopher Dickey, is there the fear that people won't turn out to vote for Barack Obama?
I'm sure that they're not going to turn out the way they did last time around. I mean, when Steve says the magic is gone, he puts his finger exactly on the problem that Obama has. Not just that the economy is difficult, but he was able to mobilize people who normally don't go out and vote. And they would get on Facebook, they would use all the social media, and what's really interesting is that his campaign was designed so that you would get on these social media and then you would be directed to take concrete actions. These are the addresses of doors you should knock on in your neighborhood. This is the amount of money you should raise. It was an incredible machine getting him elected. I don't think it's going to work nearly as well this time around.
So how he reinvents
a huge amount of money, don't forget.
And how he reinvents himself and what his opponent does, we'll pick up on that point when we return for this New Year's edition of The World This Week.